I'm Donzi Barroso. Hello, I'm Donzi Barroso, Director of Global Philanthropy at Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors. And I'm really delighted to be here with you today with two great speakers for what we hope will be an honest, inspiring, and interactive conversation about philanthropy's reckoning and response as prompted by the COVID-19 pandemic. I'll introduce our speakers and make some brief remarks, and then we'll have our discussion. And we hope to leave about 5 or 10 minutes for questions from the audience. So please send us your questions in the Q&A tab that you see to the right of your screen. So first, let me introduce our two panelists, and I can say in advance that I'm not doing them justice in the interest of time. Fred Blackwell has been CEO of the San Francisco Foundation, one of the largest community foundations in the United States since 2014. Fred has led the foundation in a renewed commitment to social justice through an equity agenda focus on racial and economic inclusion to further the foundation's mission to mobilize resources and act as a catalyst for change, to build strong communities, foster civic leadership, and promote philanthropy in the San Francisco Bay Area. And they give about $166 million a year, if I'm correct. Fred brings with him years of experience as a community leader and a prior career in public service, both in Oakland, where he's from, and San Francisco, as well as positions at other foundations and prior positions at the San Francisco Foundation. RAPSON is president and CEO of the Kresge Foundation since 2006. Rip has led the foundation to adopt an array of grant-making and investing tools to improve the economic, social, cultural, and environmental conditions of urban life through grant-making and social investing in the arts and culture, education, environment, health, human services, and community development in Kresge's hometown of Detroit. Nationally, RIP has also strengthened the philanthropy sector's role through convenings, collaboration, and supplementing community development activities in cities across the country. And the Kresge Foundation, through grants and other investment tools, makes about $160 million worth of investments a year. Rip is a veteran of urban policy and philanthropy leadership, and he began his career as a legislative assistant in Congress. Both speakers also led their foundations through impressive COVID emergency response efforts, which they will discuss. So although these two foundations are quite different in structure, community foundation, private foundation, they really share a place-based approach to their giving and a commitment to equity and inclusion and strength of community. And they have a similar level of investment. And I might also add, if my math is correct, they're both approaching milestones. So San Francisco Foundation is just short of 75 years old. And Kresge is just short of 100 years old, so that's quite something. I'm going to make some framing comments as food for thought for us. And I think I'll start by stating the obvious and saying that the pandemic has really changed everything about our work. It has made us question how we've been making decisions and how we had been defining success, especially as the pandemic's effects laid bare the inequities of our systems, but the fragilities of those systems as well. Recent World Bank research indicated that in 2020 alone, 70 to 100 million people around the globe were at risk of slipping back into extreme poverty as a result of the pandemic. So what do we need to do better, and who with? The pandemic also made us question our internal processes as grant makers, our decisions about how and where to give, and of course, it has changed how we interact with each other and with our partners. We are a changed society. It also taught us some great lessons. We can function with less bureaucracy. We can make decisions more quickly and based on common sense and real trust in our partners. This led to a number of pledges around the world for grant makers to sign on and agree to streamline processes. So one example, for example, in Europe, in Portugal, the Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation, one of the continent's largest, created a €5 million emergency response fund that it was able to get out the door within a few weeks. This is completely bypassing their normal processes. It also showed that we can work well together, and we can work with partners from the corporate and public spheres. And we saw many, many examples of that. I think we can also say now that we have truly witnessed and internalized the concept of social determinants of health. We see more donors now interested in looking at a systems lens and more openness to partnerships with different kinds of actors. We saw an unprecedented amount of money to the emergency response. So some research by Candid and the Center for Disaster Philanthropy showed that within the first 6 months of the pandemic, whereas prior emergency responses had been in the hundreds of millions of dollars, this response was at almost 12 billion. So a huge amount of capital out there waiting to do good. We also saw a number of donors engaging for the very first time. In Brazil, the single largest gift in Brazil's philanthropic history came from a private bank, Banco Itaú, which was also the first private partner in a government-backed program to provide resources for SMEs. And in one day, through an app, the bank provided $77 million worth of support, and they've pledged $600 million to that effort. We also saw an increase in tools other than standard grants. So we have examples such as the Ford Foundation of issuing debt through a bond to be able to increase its spending, and donors from around the world agreeing to increase their spending, and in places where endowments predominate, and increasing the rate of spending of the endowment to meet the moment. So we saw a lot of creativity, and we want to keep harnessing that and not losing that energy, but we also need to balance emergency needs, which I should say are ongoing in many parts of the globe, with other work that we need to do. So we need to figure out an effective way to move forward. We also need to figure out how to address the challenges of our changed society. And now in hindsight, how would we rate ourselves as a sector before the pandemic hit? Were we really being daring enough? I'm glad to say that our two panelists will be able to provide some insight into their experience and how they see the sector moving forward. So with that, without further ado, I'm going to turn to Fred. And Fred, perhaps I could ask you to talk about San Francisco Foundation's response to the pandemic and what that experience was like, given that you were already focusing on issues of equity and inclusion and building strong systems for people.
All right, thank you. Thank you for having me too. It's really a pleasure to be both with you and Rip this morning my time. I have no idea what time it is where you are.
Evening my time.
Yeah, and sorry, Rip, that I came to the party underdressed, man. I see you with your jacket and everything. I haven't had on a button up in a while, so this was about as good as it gets for me. You know, I had a mentor last summer when we were in the throes of various crises tell me that basically that we were responding to two viruses, COVID-19 and racism 20, and that one attacked the body and the other attacked the spirit, and we must not let either win. And so when I think about the last 18 months or so, I think about and reflect on kind of what we did at the San Francisco Foundation to respond to COVID-19 and the health and economic impacts that were associated with the pandemic. But I also think about the kinds of things that we had to do to be responsive to the calls for change on the racial justice front as well. And I'll start with the former. And they align with a lot of the things that you kind of said in the intro. First is, for us as a community foundation, we had this kind of two sets of business lines. We had the grant making that we do with the foundation's endowment, but then we act as a platform for others' philanthropy through donor advised funds and other vehicles. And for the first time, at least since I've been working in the community foundation space, we collaborated with all the other community foundations in the region to launch a collaborative regional fund to respond to basic needs that were emerging in the Bay Area early on in the pandemic. It was housed at the Silicon Valley Community Foundation, but we all were involved in kind of standing that up and designing how it would go and how the resources would flow. That fund was really set up to meet basic needs, food, shelter, clothing, and sometimes cash needs that were really kind of prominent during the early stages of the pandemic. And for us, just one of the things that we may be able to come back to is we had been focused for a long time really on a lot of policy and systems change work. And one of the things that the early phases of the pandemic told us was that we couldn't let go of the kind of philanthropy that really just focused in on basic needs. And we had to figure out how to balance those two. The second thing that we did was we already had a rapid response fund, but we repositioned it to be responsive to the moment as well. And while that kind of regional fund that we worked on collaboratively was focused on basic needs, really focused in on individuals and families, our rapid response fund was focused in on nonprofits that were responding to the moment, working on, again, issues of food, shelter, clothing, but also working on what we were seeing early on in this was the kind of anti-Asian sentiment that was coming down the pike. And so we wanted to have a fund that was responding to that as well. And that was part of our rapid response fund. We also did two real short-term increases, one-time increases in spending. One was for just disaster relief. We have been doing a lot of planning around disaster response, actually, because we live in earthquake country. And so we had a kind of a designated set of grantees that we knew we wanted to work with. We knew how much we wanted to give them, and we just needed to pull the lever. We had a kind of system where we would be able to deploy those dollars. We deployed them for this, although it was prepared for kind of earthquake stuff. The grantees were working in the communities and with the communities that were also heavily impacted by COVID. And so we increased spending to send support to them. And then the last thing that we did on the COVID front, which we were really proud of, is that we have a program that we've been running for a couple of decades now that selects neighborhood leaders as fellows. And we work with those leaders to distribute dollars in their community based on the needs that they see in their communities. And one of the neighborhoods that we were working in at the time was the Mission neighborhood, which in San Francisco is where there's a high population of Latinx folks that were very heavily impacted by everything that was happening with COVID. And we basically increased spending to turn over resources to those leaders and fellows so that they could determine where dollars needed to go in their community, completely driven by their interest. So those are some of the things that we did from a grant making point of view. But like you said before, we also changed how we were doing the work. So it wasn't just about the what, it was also about the how. So we tried to streamline, we tried to make things happen more swiftly. We tried to be in closer relationship with community. And actually, as that last example really typifies, find ways to put community in the driver's seat in determining where resources needed to go to be responsive to the moment. We also used our voice. There were a number of instances where we felt it was important for us as a community foundation serving the region to advocate for policy changes. So we were very vocal in encouraging local jurisdictions to do anti-eviction or eviction moratoriums and those kinds of things. We thought that was really important to do. Second thing, and I'll make this quicker, is like I said, we were working on two fronts. And in the summer of last year, we found ourselves in a position of trying to be responsive to the calls from community and the outrage from community around how they were seeing community interact with the justice system. And so there we found an even stronger, if you can believe it, intersection with our work around racial equity and economic inclusion. And so therefore decided to make a long-term increase in our spending, a moderate increase for the next 5 years, and to focus that incremental increase in spending on supporting organizations led by and working in communities of color, BIPOC communities, and pursuing transformative change and trying to build power in those communities. And so those dollars are focused on that. And we really engaged in a very deep process that we're still in, frankly, in talking to those community leaders to figure out what kinds of investments would be helpful for them in this moment as well. So sorry to be so long-winded, but we found it a great opportunity to really capitalize on our long-term commitment to equity and inclusion. And there were so many things that happened over the last 18 months that we saw as really strong intersections.
Great. Before I turn to Rip, I just wanted to ask you the programs, the real emergency response programs that you talked about, did those extend longer than you thought they would have? Are they ongoing?
They absolutely did extend longer than we thought they would, because we had so many kind of surges on both the health side and the kind of economic impacts. And so they are not ongoing funds, but they definitely did last longer than we thought they would. And if you talk to many of the folks who we work with on the ground, who have boots on the ground in the community, they will tell you that while many folks have pivoted to start to talk about recovery, there are lots of communities that are still in emergency response mode. And so we find ourselves both thinking about recovery, but continuing to think about emergency response.
Okay, thank you. Rip, could I ask you to talk about Kresge's response to the pandemic and how that may have been a complement to the foundation's existing work to strengthen communities and some of the new tools that you were introducing, or how you use those tools?
I need to back up just because I think Fred just gave us a tutorial in how philanthropy can respond across multiple dimensions. That was really impressive. And in many ways, what I might offer would be repetitive, because I think a lot of the analysis that we brought to the table was very similar to what the San Francisco Foundation did. So trying to understand how in the moment you meet individual needs, how you meet organizational needs, and yet not completely abandon the sort of the longer term, more systemic work that you're trying to accomplish. But to maybe just give a slightly different hue to it, my sense is that in many ways we felt fairly comfortable, I hope not complacent, that the organization focused on issues of equity, opportunity, and justice ought not to have to do huge pivots in terms of its broad approach to how we can be supportive in community. And yet in every dimension of our work, we had to do adaptive pivots. There was just no question about it. Operationally, all of the things, Donzi, that you and Fred talked about, fast turnaround, extending grants, adding to grants without even requests from the grantees, converting programmatic grants into operating grants. I mean, a very long list that I think is sort of common in philanthropy. I think the interesting question there is how much of that will endure. I'd like to think that we've seen sort of the other side of the doorway, and there's no reason to sort of back through it. I think we really can think much more about the kind of the streamlining, the efficiency, the closeness to ground, the trust-based philanthropy that you've both described, and making that part of the permanent DNA of not just Kresge, of most philanthropy. I think the tricky question for us was the extent to which our strategy needed to adapt, because again, I think we felt some confidence that we were reaching many of the folks in greatest duress, whether individuals, organizations, or communities, because we work not only in Detroit, but in Memphis and New Orleans and Fresno and other places as well. And what we found was that from top to bottom and side to side, the nature of the challenge had changed, certainly because of COVID, certainly because of the racial justice reckoning, but also because of the sort of the broad economic collapse that in less well-invested communities was all around us. And so we ended up trying to think very hard about how to support small businesses. That's a complicated piece of business. And And we found ourselves sort of hand in hand with a federal relief package that really wasn't doing the trick. The intentions were good, and in some cases, capital was hitting the ground in ways that we would want, but in most cases not. It was simply not reaching the smallest 1, 2, 3 person shops. It was almost completely skipping over early stage businesses, businesses led by people of color. And so we actually spent a lot of time trying very quickly, to figure out a way to take the payroll protection monies and actually move them to ground by providing bridge loans, guarantees, all sorts of trickery that ended up being quite useful and I think helped those dollars reach ground. Similarly, in the housing market, the supports that the federal government and the state government provided against evictions and foreclosures, particularly in a place like Detroit, were simply not adequate. It still left people deeply vulnerable, and certainly as the cliff appears on the horizon with the cessation of federal dollars in support of housing security, that became an area in which we felt we really needed to become much more inventive. And so I think, like Fred, we joined hands with the private sector, with the public sector, with the federal government, and have tried to create a whole suite of different ways of making sure that both COVID and the racial justice tensions did not throw people onto the mercy of a housing market that didn't much care about them. And then third, and I think probably the biggest inflection for us, was in public health. We simply do not have public health systems that are built out in places like Detroit and Memphis and New Orleans. And so how we could pool funds, to be sure, but how could we help reach people who didn't want to hear public service announcements? How could we reach people who were skeptical of government intervention? How do you almost construct a sort of a door-to-door organizing campaign to make sure that people were getting vaccinated and people were getting the best information they could to protect themselves? I mean, it was just, a tsunami of complexity that sort of swept over the public health system. And I think if I were to single out one area in which the racial justice reckoning elevated more than any other the sort of the inadequacies of the current structures and current markets, it's in public health. We just have to change this system. We cannot afford a system that does not look upstream, that does not look at the social determinants that you talked about, Donzi, that does not look at public health leadership structures at the community level, just on and on and on. It is a completely inadequate system that needs to be retooled and reinvented. So I think that in many ways our paths were parallel to Fred's, but I think coming out the other side for us, and I think Fred touched on this, the idea of responsive being sort of a polarity with strategic, I think became clearly an inadequate construct. That responsive can be strategic, and to be strategic, you have to be responsive. And then there's this sort of big piece in the middle that's opportunistic. There are things that sort of emerge as potential inflection points. I think public health is one. I think actually housing policy is another. Housing insecurity is another. And there are a number of others. And I think we're going to find that those three elements of sort of philanthropic activity are going to increasingly be mutually reinforcing and very hard to differentiate, at least for the near term. We really have got to understand that those of us who think we're strategic philanthropy have to be responsive philanthropy, and that both responsive and strategic need to be aware of the moment and taking full advantage of the moment and the possibility for inflection, particularly in sort of these long-term structural shifts that I think are becoming more and more possible with each passing day. So
thank you for that. Before I turn back to Fred, Rip, I wanted to probe just a little more, because I think in many places around the world, public health systems are seen as systems really in need of bolstering. And so as you think about the work that you may want to do in public health, what kind of partners, what kind of conversations are you having? What kind of thinking do you think is helpful, that also might be helpful to others, on this, listening to this panel?
Well, and forgive me if this is too banal, but I think we simply have to bust out of the received construct of what public health is. I mean, public health is, to be sure, health institutions engaging more with community. Public health, to be sure, is community working with our major health systems to improve service delivery at the local level. But public health is housing, public health is environment, public health is human services, public health is community development, employment, training. I mean, it is what we are seeing, I think, as a result of the pandemic in such bright relief, is that public health intersects with these systems in really powerful ways. And at least at a place like Kresge, in which we have programs in all of these different areas, going forward, we simply can't believe that anything other than a sort of a full integration of these systems is going to reach the problems. And we've talked a lot about that as philanthropy. That's part of our rhetoric, that, we're interdisciplinary, we're cross-sectoral, we're cross teams within a foundation. But doing that is really hard work. Getting our environment team and our public health team to work together is hard work. Getting our housing team and our health team to work together is really hard work. And if it's hard at a little place like Kresge, you can imagine how difficult it is in the broader public systems. And so if I had to make one suggestion for philanthropy who works in public health, it is to increasingly think about these systems as integrative systems, mutually reinforcing systems, and try to figure out how we develop a competence to sort of cross those sector lines, because I think otherwise we're going to fall right back to where we were, which is just a small little slice of community life that is public health service by public health workers. And I think it's just infinitely more complicated than that.
Sobering. Fred, if I could turn to you, because you have led, the foundation through its renewed commitment to social justice and an equity lens and an inclusive lens for philanthropies out there who may really want to re-examine what they're doing and probe more deeply in those areas. What kinds of conversations did you all have internally, and what advice could you give to foundations who want to move in this direction?
Yeah, maybe I could just give you a little bit of kind of some of the steps we went through. I often say that when I'm talking about this issue, I do it with a lot of conviction, but doesn't necessarily mean that I'm necessarily right on all this stuff. My mom often says that sometimes wrong, but never in doubt. One is that we spend a lot of time listening to community, and a lot of time taking what we heard back to our institutions at the staff and the board level to make sense of what we heard from community, and align what we heard from community with the second step, which is we basically drank data from a fire hose. We looked at data in the Bay Area disaggregated by race, by income, by issue area. It's remarkable how the wisdom of community can line up with the objectivity of the data in terms of pointing you in the right direction, in terms of the kinds of things that you need to focus in on, and the importance of race and a class analysis as you look at all that stuff. Third thing, though, is that we and continue to have a lot of uncomfortable conversations. That this is the kind of work where you have to get more comfortable with the discomfort associated with the tension, the emotion, the conflict of race in this country and in our communities. And so some very important, but I would say again, uncomfortable conversations about race were prerequisite for us to really deeply engage in the work. And then the two other things that I would say here, and they will sound like they're in conflict with one another, but they actually work in concert. The first is that it's important to actually do the work. And when I say that, what I mean is we tend to have, especially in philanthropy, a long runway of conversation before we actually do something. And I think that the conversation is important, but the conversation has to take place while you do some OJT on this stuff and actually get into the work and learn and make mistakes based on the work that you are engaged in, rather than just having it be a cerebral exercise. The second, though, is we've got to slow down. There's a difference between acting with urgency and acting with haste. And we have a tendency, I think, sometimes, particularly when it comes to issues of race, to run through the door, pledge a lot of money, hope that everything will change in the next 3 to 6 months, and then move on to the next issue. But for an issue like race and racial justice, it's important to have the long view. It's important to slow down, because I found that, there's all this hand wringing that was going on last summer around whether this was a window or a point in time, or we were on our way to a movement. And I would say that to the extent that we act like it's a moment, we will make it a moment. And that to the extent that we act like it's a longer term thing, and we take our time and be deliberate about how we're going to respond to this, the more likely we are to turn this into a more long-term view of the work that we need to do.
Oh, there's a question from the audience that I thought I'd just pop in at this moment, which is to your point about listening to community, Fred. Is it time to put the community in the driver's seat, on decisions? And same to you, Rip.
Sure.
I'm laughing. It's past time for us to do that. It's stuff that we should have been doing for a long time. We have an opportunity to change that trajectory now. It's been really interesting to me. One of the things that I didn't talk about was we brought together our donors at the foundation at many points over the last 18 months, both to kind of encourage them to move in the kinds of directions that we were moving in, but also give them the opportunity to talk to one another about what they were reading, what resources they were availing of themselves to be responsive to the moment, and what kinds of things that they were doing differently. And one of the things that was surprising to me was the extent to which our donors at the foundation were really seeking ways to get into closer proximity with community in respectful ways, so that they felt that they could be more effective in their approach. I talked about the things that we were doing in the Mission neighborhood in San Francisco. We also established a Latinx kitchen cabinet where we brought together Latino leaders from across the region to give us feedback and insight into the things that we need to be doing in that community. We have a program that we've been running for decades now called the FACE program, which is about supporting the role that faith-based institutions play in community development and community service. And that's a program where if they don't move, nothing happens. And so all those things are things that we're doing, but I think that we are overdue for shared decision-making. We are overdue for doing more asking of community around where the places that we need to be responsive. And I find that in almost every instance, our strategies are strengthened by sitting back and asking before doing.
Donzie,
Go ahead.
Just sort of punctuate that. The flow of federal dollars, both that we've received and that we hope to receive, I think really calls this question. So you have these huge amounts of relief dollars flowing into community, and how are they going to get spent? I mean, part of it is just going to plug budget holes. We get that. That needs to happen. You need to make sure pensions are paid, all of that. But there is also a real question about the appetite at the local level for truly distributive leadership, either in setting the table, setting the question, helping absorb the capital, helping deploy the capital. And at least in the cities in which we work, we see that the public sector has obviously got the election certificate. They sit right where they need to, and they're going to ultimately make the final decisions. But they simply cannot do this without community. You cannot figure out how to move these amounts of monies or these policy changes without the nonprofit sector, without the private sector, and without community-based organizations. And I think one of the reasons that has been slow to emerge is that it's politically really tough. It's really tough in Detroit, where you have I think a good, enlightened, competent mayor to basically let go and basically say, you tell me how you want to spend these monies. Once we can figure out how we want to spend these monies, we'll figure out what delivery systems are possible. And once those delivery systems are possible, I'm going to actually sort of delegate to community the ability to move them into the kinds of channels they need to be moved into. We have to, not only do we have to reinvent the public health system, where I went on and on about, but you have to figure out a different way of moving capital into community. You have to figure out a different method of decision making. You have to figure out, I mean, the list goes on. And I think that the question's point is absolutely spot on, that unless we evolve different ways of actually distributing these responsibilities and opportunities, then we're going to be back in the same cul-de-sac we have been in for a long time. And so I think if I take some optimism from where we've been in these last couple of years, it is that we've begun pushing on those systems. We've begun understanding what it means to invest in community-based organizations, in organizations led by people of color, in organizations that haven't filed 990s for the last 5 years that we can take apart and put back together. We've got to take different risks. We've got to have different sets of confidences and a different set of trusts. And I would say that's one of the reasons I think organizations like Fred's are so important. I think what we have seen is, forgive me, Fred, a moment for community foundations. I think that the possibility of seeing community foundations in a very different light, these aren't just sort of repositories for donor advised funds. These are organizations that are close to community, that have the potential to hear community, to translate for community, to be part of community. It's a really important development. And I'm just delighted that you have organizations the quality of the San Francisco Foundation in that situation.
And just one thing I would add here briefly, just in a couple of seconds, is that the involvement of community in our decision-making process can't just revolve around where the money needs to go. Yep. We've also got to involve community in the strategy design, like where the verticals that need to be supported. So, I mean, it really is comprehensive. And I think one of the really exciting ways that's happening is in something that we're involved in with a bunch of other foundations here in California, which is the California Black Freedom Fund, where the movement leaders that we are actually intending to support are around the table on equal footing with us around trying to figure out exactly strategically where the right investments are. And they actually are more interested in being at the table on the strategy side, and we can make the decisions around the money, to tell you the truth. Like, they really want to be involved in strategy design.
I was just going to comment that it's, Rip, to your point, the community foundation movement is, in constant evolution, and it's experiencing a lot of growth outside of the, United States is where it sort of emerged, but there are examples in Europe and Latin America and other places where it's really taking off. So that's very encouraging.
One thing what I love about the moment, though, is that for so long, we as a field operated with the model of the assumption that we needed to be as opaque as possible around what we believed in so that we wouldn't repel anyone. And what I love about kind of where I see the field moving is that more and more we are wearing our values on our sleeves and being really clear about what we think is important in terms of moving the needle in our communities. And while it has created some turbulence and we've lost some donors, we have gained far more than we've lost.
So, Fred, how do you get that message to other community foundations? So if you were to come to Southeast Michigan and talk to our community foundation, what would you tell them they could do to move that needle?
I would just show them our data. I mean, when we pivoted to being like really clear about how we wanted to impact the region around racial equity and economic inclusion, ever since then, we have had like a series of record-breaking years in terms of our growth and the donors that are coming to the table and the amount that they're coming to the table with. And there's just an increased level of alignment between what we're doing programmatically and what our donors are doing with their philanthropic dollars as well. So I think the most powerful thing that I could do is just show them our data and our trend line around our alignment and our fundraising.
It's true that donors, everything you've said has prompted questions that I'd love to have the time to ask. Your comment about opacity is so spot on, because even, in the non-community foundation world, philanthropies around the world, there's a real reckoning too with questions of legitimacy, and the transparency helping to bolster that legitimacy to act as private actors in the public sphere. I think I'm going to, in the interest of time, since we have just a couple of minutes, we wanted to sort of maybe conclude thinking about where you've both touched on this already, but where we really need to go as a sector, and things that you see that you find encouraging, or things that that you think still need to really be moved. Rip, you've mentioned how we conceive of public health systems, what kinds of, you've both talked about what kinds of conversations we have and how with different partners. But are there things that you're seeing in the broader sense that you find really encouraging, that others in other parts of the world or here that we could share and learn from as a broader community?
Can I do a quick one, Fred, and then step out of the way? I think the convergence of the sort of the economic constriction, racial reconciliation, and public health, I guess to a lesser extent, suggests a huge opening for new wealth building strategies. We've talked about this for a long time in philanthropy, and how people can get banked and how people can build savings and be better consumers and all that. But when you think about the potential for genuinely testing out new models of community ownership of assets, different models of building wealth in low wealth communities, like small business, like home ownership. I mean, it's not that this is a mystery to us how you do it, but I do think that there is some, again, inflection that may well be possible out of this last couple of years, that sort of increases the legitimacy of the idea that we really can take very proactive, in some cases, sort of radical steps to build wealth in communities that have traditionally not had them. And I think that's a possible avenue for philanthropy, I think, to be a very powerful player.
Mm-hmm. Fred, what about you? What are you seeing?
Yeah, so when I came to philanthropy from the public sector, I was really struck by how the jewel in the crown, it felt like, in philanthropy was to be able to support innovative programs and services at scale in nonprofit organizations, sometimes in a way that was completely sealed off from government. I quickly started telling my staff and the folks who would listen that if we thought that we were going to move the needle on these huge, thorny, complex issues, and that we could do it without some level of partnership and engagement and collaboration with government, we were fooling ourselves. Here in California, we've got some of the largest healthcare foundations in the country. We've got the California Endowment, the Wellness Foundation, Sierra Health, California Healthcare Foundation. Some of them might even be in the audience, and I'm not saying this in a disparaging way. If you add up all that they spend in the state of California in any given year, I bet you it's less than what the county of San Francisco spends on public health that same year. And so getting upstream, working on policy and advocacy and systems change, and supporting communities to have the power to influence that systems change is something that I've seen more of, and I hope that it continues.
Fred, thank you for summarizing I think the main points of our conversation and how the philanthropic community globally can try to move forward. So with that, thank you all for your attention and for your questions. And this was really fun. Thank you so much for your insights.
Thanks, Donzie.
Bye.